Texas and Oklahoma, I don't really think that a lot of people expect them to really be able to compete in the SEC. How do you think they're going to do in the SEC next year, making that transition?
Um, hmm. Well, it's really interesting, and the reason it's fascinating is because I have questions about Steve Sarkisian as a head coach, and I don't think Brent Venables is going to do well as a head coach. But they're also both recruiting well, so they're in similar positions in one sense. However, I think Texas is going to enter the SEC. And originally, when this happened, I said they're going to enter the SEC and go 5-7. I was making those jokes because at the time in 2021, they weren't good. They just weren't. But then this year happened. Their recruiting has been consistent, and they're not in the SEC yet. So I have, a right to change my opinion and set that in stone before they enter. Now I think they're going to enter and immediately compete. They have a great wide receiver core. They're recruiting extremely well in the trenches. They have a great play. Whether you think Steve Sarkisian's a great game manager and a head coach, he's a great play caller. So offensively, they have all the tools they need to succeed. Defensively, they took a massive step forward from 2021 to 2022, and they returned most of that production. So now that they've showed me they can play well defensively as well, now I just got to see who Steve Sarkisian is in close possession games against the best of the best teams. And whether that's Alabama this year or Kansas State or TCU or whoever they play in the Big 12 championship game, if he just wins a handful of those and gets double-digit wins and wins the Big 12 like I think he will, I think they can be one of the nation's best teams, if not a playoff contender, not just this year, but a true national title, like larger than 1% chance to win it all in 2024. Oklahoma, I don't have hope. I have very little hope. And I think that's just because they lost a lot under Lincoln Riley. I know that. And it's sort of just a hunch that I have. I don't know the Big 12 as well as I do the Big 10, but the defense they had was so inexcusably bad. You're moving from the Big 12 to the SEC, and you took over 2 years before you do that. So you don't have much time to get things right before you hit what arguably is now the toughest conference in America. And defensively, I don't think they're great. They have better depth now, and all I've been hearing in the preseason is, "Oh, how good is Jackson Arnold? He's so good, and he's such an upgrade." Well, you already have a good quarterback. You already have a good quarterback. So, as much as the depth helps, the fact that nothing else is being talked about, I think is a concern. And I wonder, like losing, for example, Marvin Mims. I wonder who's going to replace him. I wonder how, their schedule's easy. But what happens when they face Texas again? Or what happens when, TCU comes to town? Or when they face Kansas, who hung 42 on them last year and returns a ton of production? What happens to Oklahoma? Not every. I know that we love, because I love, success stories as well. Maybe it's hard to believe, but I do. Not every new head coach can be successful. And I like Lanning. I like DeBoer. I now like Dykes. At some point, one of them I just have to lay my hand on and say, I don't think so. And going 6-7 at Oklahoma, even with all they lost, you can't do that. If you go 6-7 with that schedule, you enter the SEC in the Big Ten with that same team, you go 4-8 or 3-9. And the conversation's even worse. So I love Texas in the SEC. I think it's going to work. I think they might become a premier program in the SEC, like up there at the top of the hill, especially when Saban retires, inevitably. Oklahoma, Mike Valeni, a guy that I listened to in '97, won the ticket in Detroit. He said, I think Oklahoma is going to go back to the Howard Schnellenberger era where they struggle to go bowling. I'm more inclined to believe that than the fact that Oklahoma will win the SEC. I truly am. Yeah.
Damn.
And I mean, listen, I love Brent Venables. And I'm going to give him a little bit of a benefit of a doubt. I'm just going to act like last year didn't happen. I'm just going to take that thing and, rip it in trash and throw it away and just forget about 2022. Because he did lose a lot on defense. They didn't really have a lot of depth. But he is one of the best defensive minds in recent memory in college football. I expect that defense to make some massive improvements. And when I say massive improvements, like this should be a massively improved defense. Offensively, I think they're going to be fine. Jeff Lebby is a really good offensive coordinator. And I don't think Oklahoma is going to go into the SEC and be as good as Texas. I just think that Texas is just so much of a juggernaut. It's like Texas is like USC, Florida, FSU. You get the right coach in there, you recruit well, you should immediately be able to contend no matter what conference you're in. You should immediately be a national championship contender. And I feel like Texas has a lot more momentum going into the SEC, especially if they perform at a really high level this year than what Oklahoma is going to have.
Yeah.
My thing with Brent Venables and why I may have a little bit more confidence in him than you do, I still don't think that Oklahoma is going to be the cream of the crop of the SEC, but I think they could be an 8-9 win program. And, with how the schedule lines up, they can get a couple of breaks here and there. Maybe they could make it to a couple of SEC championship games or not. But Brent Venables does have a lot to prove. I don't know if he'll be a championship caliber coach, but I think he can be a pretty serviceable head coach, have you around that 8, 9, 10 win range. This is somebody who has been on a lot of national championship staffs. Dabo Swinney with Clemson, Bob Stoops in the early 2000s at OU. So he knows what it takes to build a championship program, and he does have pretty good charisma. He's able to, galvanize his players. His players do love playing for him. He brings a really unique energy. I am skeptical about him, but I don't think like he'll end up, fizzling out and being a disaster in the SEC. When I look at Steve Sarkisian in Texas, though, I mean, I expect them to hit the SEC running. Like, I feel like a lot of people are hating on Texas because, it's easy to hate on Texas. They've been down for so long in terms of every single year. Well, I won't say every single year, but, everybody's always quick to shout Texas is back, and then they go and they disappoint. But I really feel like Texas is back, bruh. I really feel if you're an Alabama fan, or LSU fan, a Tennessee fan, and even a Texas A&M fan, LSU fan, Texas A&M, when they hit the Southeastern Conference, like, they're coming for throats. They're coming to take it all. Like, I don't think this is the same Texas program that it was under Tom Herman or Charlie Strong. Steve Sarkisian, he's a really good recruiter, and it really seems like he kind of is now starting to hit his strides at, Texas. And he also has a really good staff, and he also knows the SEC pretty good. So if I'm a Bama fan or just a fan of the SEC in general, I don't think Texas is going to come in and they're going to lay down and they're not going to be able to live up to the hype, because we know how good Texas is when you get it all figured out. And I think Texas is really close to having that thing all figured out. And if they get that thing all figured out this season and they go into the SEC with the Big 12 championship, and they don't even got to make it to the college football playoffs. Let's say they have a 10-win season. Quinn Ewers hits the NFL draft. Next up is Arch Manning. You feel me? I think any non-Texas fan who is following the SEC closely, doubting Texas would be a huge mistake. And I feel like Texas needs to start being viewed very seriously. I don't no longer think that they're one of those teams that you can just make a joke at and just meme and just think that, they're just going to disappoint. Like, I feel like Texas is for real under Steve Sarkisian. He has a really good staff. They hit that recruiting trail really hard. I mean, I really love what Texas could do in the SEC. And for you, do you think that Texas could immediately go in and just win that thing year one in 2024? Or do you think it may take maybe 2 years?
I did schedule predictions for 2024 because I'm just that, just into it. Because 2024 is a huge year. 12-team playoff. You have, the Pac-12 is no longer going to exist in 2024. New TV contracts. Big Ten's going to have 4 new teams. I did schedule predictions, and Texas they have a really nice schedule for 2024. Toughest game in conference, because this is what we're talking about, the SEC, is Georgia, and Georgia's at home. It's going to be a new environment for Georgia, and it's hostile, and Texas will be the most talented they've ever been in over a decade. And their next toughest game will probably be on the road at Texas A&M, who I think is a plainly inferior coach. They could win it in year one. I seriously think they have the talent. Even if Steve Sarkisian isn't the GOAT coach, and I kind of use that remark with some cynicism and sarcasm because people toss it around all the time, even if he isn't an elite coach, the sheer talent they have might be enough for them to do something like that, especially a quarterback. I mean, Malik Murphy and then Arch Manning behind him. I'm a firm believer in that quarterback room. I'm a firm believer in the development they've done at wide receiver and tight end and offensive line and defense too. They're getting better defensively. They could go in the SEC and they could flat out win in year one. I think that. And people will say, well, they haven't, you're giving them a ton of benefit of the doubt or you're overrating them. And I get that. But I've also been the person who said last year that they were overrated because they were. They were not going to win the Big 12 last year. They weren't. They were too anti-clutch and mentally weak.
And really
And
young.
yes, and they had an injured quarterback. Like Quinn Ewers was not the same after he took that hit. And Oklahoma is the same thing this year. Like they're rated highly. ESPN's FPI has them in the top 15 by odds. They're favored to, be in that Big 12 championship game in the second place. Like you can't say that one is overrated, in my opinion. Not at least question that about the other. Oklahoma's move to the SEC, I think, is like Nebraska's to the Big Ten. Like that could
Oh,
that could
whoa.
that could prove to be like gross, honestly. Like not from a geographic standpoint, and it could work, but you got to have the right head coach. And you don't have Texas recruiting, you don't have Florida, you have pipelines, but you don't have that. There's just something about Texas and what they're doing right now. They're on the uptrend. And my opinions could totally change after this year because you have one more year to prove yourselves before everyone's predictions of how your future is going to be are final, because then you're in the conference and that's a different conversation. But from how things look currently, you go 6-7 in year one. Your team gets, even before Dylan Gabriel was hurt, I mean, TCU just had like 3 or 4 plays of 70-plus yard touchdowns. It's like that was disgusting. Texas, meanwhile, was so close to being great, but they still went bowling, and they still competed with Alabama, Washington, even beat Kansas State, competed with TCU, Oklahoma State. Like all those teams were ranked at the time that they played them. They had one of the tougher schedules in the country, and they went 8-5. And they're recruiting well. Oklahoma's recruiting well too, but you can't only recruit, you got to coach. And maybe, I mean, I'm obviously going on more of a stretch than you are. You're probably wiser by giving Brent Venables more of a benefit of the doubt. There's just something about Oklahoma's move versus Texas's that it's different. And I think that Texas, to go back to your question, as I've said before, they could go into the SEC. And it's unlikely, yeah, because Georgia, Alabama have better head coaches. LSU's recruiting well, but Texas could go in and win year one. Why not? They're going to do it at some point. They're too good of a program. They recruit too well, and I, I
They got too much
yeah,
money. Money,
yeah.
them pockets deep down there in Texas. They got oil, they got a lot of things. Like they got some really rich boosters. This Texas probably has like a couple of a million, like $100+ million boosters, and their alumni back in that anything they need, they got it. Oklahoma, I know they got some pretty deep pockets down there too. That's why I'm giving Brent Venables the benefit of the doubt. Like the biggest thing to me to survive in the SEC, first of all, you gotta recruit. Okay, if you're not recruiting at a high level, I don't really think you can have too much success in the SEC. So the fact that Brent Venables has a pretty solid coaching staff and they are recruiting at an insanely high level, I think you could probably make the argument that he's probably recruiting at a better level than what Lincoln Riley was. I think a large reason why Lincoln Riley left OU is because it was a little bit more difficult for him to recruit the area versus him going to USC, and Cali's just rich with talent, and if USC has a good year, it's easily just to scoop up the best players in that state and build your team in Cali just alone. But I kind of feel with Brent Venables, he could be somebody who could end up not working out. But I think with the championship pedigree that he has, being on a lot of championship staffs, I think he probably should end up at least being able to keep Oklahoma a 8-9 win program in the SEC.